Maybe.
Excuse me, information.
Did I find out? Are we running?
I
think so.
Never been out of one since maybe a half a mile, 3/4 of a mile. And he lived on the city side of now we had to go to that upper St. Clair Hospital. He was scared.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. We are in a couple closer to the front if you're interested. What a great turnout. Thank you all for coming. We'll let that siren stop. Additional things we're going to hear when we start a program here. I'm Lauren Bairnsfather. I'm director of the Holocaust Center here, and thank you for coming to the Speakers event. We've had, I don't like to start things on a sad note, but we've had a rough couple of weeks. We lost survivors last week, Egon Ballas. And he did speak recently at the University of Pittsburgh. If anyone had a chance to hear that, I was not able. So I'm thrilled that you're here today and that we have Susan Hawkins to speak to us. Susan is a professor on the faculty at Chatham. She was founding faculty and their physician's assistant and has made a huge contribution to the area in that role. Also, I just learned that Susan moved to Pittsburgh to attend Carnegie Mellon and has been, so she was a transplant to Pittsburgh before it was the popular thing to do. So I think that that's notable. I also want to say that this is sponsored by the Snow Foundation, which is a fund at the Pittsburgh Foundation. And because of their support, we've been able to live stream these lectures, hold them all over town, also bring in generation speakers to meet with school groups, which Susan did recently. If I may tell this story, it was for the School for the Deaf. And in prep, you were able to introduce yourself in sign language. I understand. We were also moved by that. So wonderful. So it's my privilege and my pleasure to phone to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you so much, and Hawkins. And I'm a little bit curious about who's here because you're going to be coming at the things that I have to say from different points of view. So I'm wondering, and you don't have to, but if you would like to, are there other people who are children of survivors who are here in the audience? Welcome. Thanks for being here. And do we have survivors in the audience who don't mind saying thank you for being here? And people who are friends of people who are survivors or children of survivors? And then the cure. It's great. Anybody here getting credit for school? It's wonderful. So I think we got just about everyone here. I'm going to be telling stories, and they are different stories. My mother's story from my point of view, my father's story from my point of view, my story from my point of view, and even a little bit about my husband's and my children's story from my point of view. But to give you an example of some of the things that go on with children of survivors, earlier this week I made pasta for dinner, and I was rinsing out the pot in the sink. And my first thought was, someone in a concentration camp would have knocked somebody else over to drink the contents of this pot. And those are the kind of thoughts that I've found are really common for children of survivors. And I didn't know that growing up. My parents ended up living in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which for those of you who haven't been east of the mountains, it's a little bit north of Philadelphia. And at the time was not a big survivor community. I think I knew 3 people that my parents hung out with who were survivors, had children at home. My parents were quite a bit older when they had me, so I really had 0 peers. I didn't know other child of survivors till I came to Pittsburgh. And so everything that I thought and everything that I felt was all internal. It was very weird. you know, I knew that I was weird, so that, you know, but how many of you thought you were weird when you were a teenager, even if you were fairly, you know, ordinary? So I was really convinced that my weirdness was all about being a child of survivors. And it's all about the unspoken, about the things that weren't said as much as what was said, or the looks that my parents would, when topics came up, or the fury that they had when I misbehaved. Because it wasn't like I was just a kid misbehaving. It was like I was misbehaving in front of all my dead relatives. And now a lot more, and I actually have been reading a lot of things, literature about children of survivors. It's not anything that's done to you, it's just the way it is. It's like the water that you live in, if you're a fish, is just, it doesn't even feel like water. The house that you live in has a certain sadness underneath that you can't name, but you just know that it's there. So there were certain things that I later found out were unusual that I now know are fairly common in homes of survivors. So, for example, Elisheva, there are 2 seats up here if you want to see. Thanks, good to see you. So, for example, all the doors were always open. And that includes the bathroom doors. Like, just all the doors were always open. I had no idea that was weird till I brought kids. And I went to the bathroom and didn't close the door. And they were like, what are you doing? It just was, nobody closed doors in our house. And how that stood later in life is that when I got married and my husband and I moved into our house, he disappeared. And I was looking around like, where is he? And he came upstairs and I said, why didn't you tell me you went down to the basement? And he looked at me like I was completely crazy. Like, I have to tell you that I'm going down to the basement. But again, it was another one of those unspoken in our house that you let people know where you were. That it was, somehow I knew that it was important that my parents know where I was. Even in the house, important that people could see each other and know where they were. And I didn't know that was weird. And I also didn't know how ingrained it was in me until I saw that that's not what everybody did. Again, this isn't everybody's story, this is my story, but the more stories I read, the more I see stuff like that. So this was my father. His name was David Robinson, and his name was David Robinson, which is now part of the Ukraine, but which was Czechoslovakia, Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I was able to look up the cemetery records, and all of their names are Robinson, spelled R-O-B-I-N-S-O-N, although they would have been written in Yiddish, and they would have been written with Yiddish letters when my father was growing up. But I found that really curious. So he is wearing, there's a date, 1926 on here, and he's wearing a probably Austro-Hungarian uniform in the military, and so this was obviously before World War II, and many European people thought they just belonged to their nationality. They didn't necessarily consider themselves different because they were Jewish. And to tell you a little bit about my father's personality, which I believe is part of how he survived, when they asked him what he did when he came into the military, he said, I'm a cook. The man had never cooked a thing in his entire life, but his instincts were that cooks are near the food, and that if you're near the food, you're going to survive. And so they taught him how to cook, because once they already call you a cook, they're not going to say they made a mistake and you're not a cook, so that he actually could cook when I was growing up. And that's another picture of him. He looks a lot like my older brother. So there are 2 of us. I have a brother who is 6.5 years older than me. I'm hoping that he's watching on the live stream. And he's really an important part, I think, of how I turned out the way I did. He was very much my intercessor with my parents. He kind of took the brunt of they really, they're like dreams of success. And I felt like he shielded me a lot from a lot of things. He also taught me a lot because my parents both worked, which was very unusual when I was growing up in the 50s. They had a store and they worked all the time in the store. And my brother played school with me and taught me things, taught me how to read, taught me geography, taught me all kinds of things. And I really would say just had me be a multiple person than I probably would have been without him. So that's a picture of my father with his son. So my father was married before the war, as were many people, and he had 3 children. My daughter pointed out to me, my middle daughter, I have 3 daughters, and she said, I think it's really interesting that your father lost 3 children and you had 3 children. Just for whatever, that caught her attention. So this is in a park in Munkacs. So why are these pictures in such terrible shape? Well, again, in our house, all the pictures were under the cage. And it was a behavior of somebody could break into your house at any time, so you don't put any of your valuables in a place, you put them in an illogical place. So consequently, we sat on these pictures for years, and again, it never seemed weird to me. I thought that's what everybody did. It wasn't until I went to somebody's house where they had albums and the pictures were sitting on a shelf that I thought, why are our albums all, why are our pictures all, and there weren't obviously many of them because they had to be able to get them out of Europe. And truthfully, I have how he even had these pictures. It's just one of those things that I'm never going to know the answer to. So that was his whole family. That was his 3 children. So these are my half siblings. And I did some training as a Gestalt, and it was in one of the training sessions that the trainer said, why don't you put them up on your wall and introduce them to people and let people know about them, because that's the only way that they're going to have life. So now my husband had this refinished and framed, and it's in our living room, and my kids know these are my half siblings, and I'm not even sure their names. Because again, it wasn't talked about. The pictures were under the couch cushions. I knew they made my dad really sad. And again, I read about this a lot with a lot of children of survivors. You're scared of your parents' pain, you're curious, but you want to know and you don't want to know. Because you want to know, and then this might be really terrible. And what I found for most people is that it's actually worse not to know, because the things that I imagine might be not as bad. But there are a lot of things that I don't know. And by the time that I had the emotional foundation to hold those things that they might have to tell me, they were already incapacitated. Both of my parents had strokes. For those of you survivors who can talk, I am so glad that you're talking and telling people, because it's important to know. So I know dribs and drabs. I know stories and little things, but I don't know the whole picture of what happened. But I can tell you what happened to my father. So in Munkacs, my father was a salesman, and he was well thought of, and had many, and they told him that the men were going to be taken away to a work camp. So he went and hid, that anything else was going to happen. And what he would do was he would sneak back into town to visit his family and check on them and back out again. And one of the times that he came back into town, they were gone. And he found out that they didn't survive. So he spent time, he said, in a hospital laundry chute. So if you can imagine what kinds of things get thrown into a hospital laundry chute. And again, many things I don't know about what else happened to him, but I know that he, after the war, Budapest, and that was where he met my mother. So he didn't talk about his family, and I don't know, when he would get really, I don't know how many of you know this gesture, but he would bite his fist. And that was the most terrifying thing to me. Like, that was, he had smacked me across the face. Because what it looked like was these big emotions that he had to bite his own fist so they explode, and that's what it felt like. And so I didn't really want to bring things up that made him feel that way. And how that is. So that's my mother, Margaret Robinson. Her maiden name was Haas. She grew up in a small town in Hungary called Kaba. It was on the main train line between Budapest and a city called Debrecen, which I think is the thing in Hungary. She actually took a train an hour and a half each school in Debrecen. That was fairly typical of people to do. But that town was and still is about 5,000 people, so it's definitely a small town. Her father had a bakery, and he also made liquor, fruit, like they had fruit trees, so he made plum liqueur and things like that. Plums are very, very big in Hungary, and they were very big in their hometown. And she also was a seamstress, so she made this dress. But what I got from the conversation was that my mother was in love with a guy, and she got this guy, she just didn't tell me details, that he had had an arm amputated from a motorcycle accident, and that her mother didn't want her. So I'm guessing he would have been one of the first people killed because he would have been defective. So, so that might be the story of why my mother was at this point. But she had this very successful business in her sewing school, and seemed like she liked it. This is Margot. Margot was not Jewish, and Margot and she grew up together in this town. And I believe my mom made that dress. My mom made Margot's clothes also. And she would talk about her, and she'll come up later in the story. That synagogue in Kaba, which was destroyed during World War II, and there was not ever a replacement synagogue to my knowledge. And my mother's house. So, you know, it was very modest. That this was not an era of, this was not a town that had any big houses. Everything in the town looks like that. And his business was on the first floor, and they slept on the second floor, which was also very common for that era. And remember this, because this is important later too. That is one of my mother's brothers named Ernest, which would be Ernest. He did after the war. She was one of, I found out later, 7 siblings. She always told me there were 6 siblings, and there were 4 girls. One girl died before the war. I thought it was of tuberculosis, but I don't have any evidence of that. So in '44, the Jews in Kaba were taken first to Debrecen and put in a ghetto there, and then transported to concentration camps. And in Budapest Holocaust Museum now, which in a place that was another way station where Hungarian Jews were held on the concentration camps. So my mother described being marched down the street of their town, which only has one main, and people yelling things at them. And I remember her saying, these were my friends, they were people that I knew, and they were yelling these horrible things. I didn't believe it. And she told me they had buried valuables in the yard, which many people did. And then she went to Auschwitz, and she went from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. So she was in 2 camps, and she was there until the liberation. And one of the things she told me about the liberation was that, so, you know, well, first of all, one of the stories she told me about entering the concentration camps, and I've read this in other accounts, was that all of the women had their heads shaved, way of being humiliated. And she said they were all from the same town, and like, oh, you look like your brother. Oh my gosh, you look like your brother. You look like your. They were sort of laughing hysterically. Some of it was just hysteria, I'm sure, but some of it was also an attempt to be humorous and talking about that. And when they liberated her camp, what they wanted to do was to go and use, because for all the time there they were not allowed to use a bathroom. They basically had something that was a wooden hole, and then make the guards clean it up. But she said that's what they wanted. They wanted somehow to have the dignity of using a bathroom, and they wanted to humiliate the guards who persecuted them. So again, I didn't hear a lot of stories. She talked about being made to kneel down on ice for long periods of time. Just for nobody had pants. They wore a kind of a smock dress and wooden shoes. So this was winter time, and you know. And how my mom survived, I don't know for sure. What she told me was that she sewed clothing she was a seamstress, so that's possible. But I also know from reading a lot of accounts that a lot of women in prison would have been of her age and very nice looking were abused by the Nazis. And I don't know that that's not true. My mom had some very disturbed ideas about men and love that she shared with me. She shared those views. I get views like that just accidentally. So that's my thought, is that, you know, something so terrible that she didn't want to tell me. And I think if that wasn't her story, that was somebody's story. So after the war, she went back to her hometown. Here's another missing piece. It didn't even occur to me to ask, how'd you get back? So what I've read is that many people walked. Many people walked for hundreds of miles to get home. And they were often in danger walking. There were still people who were not happy that they were coming back from the camps. So when she got there, she didn't say much about that. All I know is that she went to Budapest. She met my father there. When she came back to her town, the brother of this man she was in love with wanted to marry her. That was a very, very common thing. If someone lost a significant person, they married their brother, their cousin, whoever, to try to keep the families together and recreate a family. So this guy, Otto, her boyfriend was Gustav, Otto wanted to marry her. He was a doctor, and she didn't want to stay in Hungary. She said, I want to get out of Hungary, and he wanted to stay. So, and she met my father, and they both wanted to come to America. I believe that they came illegally. That was also known. I know that they came over on a troop ship, and that my brother, who was born while they were waiting to get out of Hungary, were in I believe, a displaced persons camp for a while, which was also not unusual. My brother was born in Budapest, and when they left Budapest, they put him in a baby carriage. They put their belongings underneath him in the baby carriage. They left the food stove so that nobody would suspect that they had left, and they went into the woods. And my brother, who was around at the time, believes that he remembers people saying, leave him there, because he started to scream. And they had given him medicine to quiet him, but as sometimes happens, it had the opposite reaction, and he was screaming. And so to this day, he does not like trees, he does not like the woods, and you know, those are things I was spared because I did not have that experience. To the States. That's my brother. That one was taken in Hungary before he left. And it's interesting because the necklace that he's wearing was my mother's, because I remember her wearing that, so you know, that was that. And his hair wasn't cut because at that point I think my father became more religious, and so they were cutting the boy's hair. And that's my brother's papers, so I'm sort of excited to have that. He was first in 47, and they came over, I think, 49. And now you can see the difference in my mother after the war. Like, to me, I had a haunted look in her eyes that's different than the one that was taken, that you saw earlier before the war. And that's a lot of my mother. I think she was really sad. Now, she also was really fun. There were times that she was, you know, really, she liked to tell Jen. She liked to drink wine on Passover and dance around the dining room table. So there were also times that were really fun. But they were too dark, and she would take to her bed for 2 or 3 days at a time and not get up. And as an adult, I totally understand that. As a child, and it was not understandable. So that's the 3 of them. So you can see they're a good bit older. I think it was 53 when I was born, which again is not unusual. My mother was, I believe, 41 when I was born. So these things are really important and they're personal, but I'm going to share them because this is part of my story. So later on in my life when I was a teenager, and I was kind of being what I thought was a normal teenager, as best I did something disobedient, my mother said, "We weren't even going to have you." I was supposed to have an abortion, and the doctor who was going to do the abortion got arrested the day before, I was supposed to go. She did it in anger. It was like, "You are such a bad kid." And I share that because there was a different kind of anger. And it's like, after all we went through, how could you be a bad kid? And I think that a lot of children of survivors feel that really deeply. Like, what right did I have to disobey? What right did I have to be a bad kid? After all they've been through, I should be a good kid. So I was kind of the entertainer of the family. So, I did music lessons and dancing lessons, and I was in plays. My brother is reserved and does much more like intellectual behind the scenes things. And I think that was very much because I could kind of let other parts of my personality out. So that was my mother's other brother. He survived and came back to her. But you can see he looks about 70 there. He had to have been in his early 40s. He was not an old man. But he was very sick. Married a woman, a not Jewish woman in the town, and stayed in Kava, which my mother didn't want to do. He had 2 daughters, and he died when they were fairly young. So we used to get letters. My mother used to send money to them from America. It was a big deal, these little envelopes, and it was just sending money to Kava, and we'd get letters from them, and my mother would cry, and there was just a lot of emotion around all of that. So in 1979, my husband and I, when we met, so he has a completely different background. For those of you who've ever seen Braveheart, I know you're old enough to see, many of you, so Mel Gibson movie. My husband can trace his family all the way back to Robert the Bruce. He's the guy who wore the fur movie and was a bad guy. So he has this huge sense of who his family is. Millions of pictures of he knew his great grandmother. And I didn't even have a picture of any of my grandparents. Just nothing. And I think that was really hard. That for me, especially in the town we grew up in, everybody had grandparents, it felt like. Everybody had cousins. I grew up feeling like, I just have my brother. And interestingly, to this day, we talk to each other every day. And I do, my husband and my brother are my 2 closest people, and then my daughters are my next closest people. Because that's, I did not have a big family, or even a family. So when I met my husband, we both went to CMU, like the complete opposite people. You could not have had 2 more opposite people. And he grew up in a town that had only one Jew in the whole town, the Papermeisters, and they were the druggists. They owned the drugstore, so they were the Papermeisters, the druggists. And people who were Catholic were unusual. So it was just a very kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant town. And we met, and he had won a fellowship. He's an architect, and he had won a fellowship to travel around Europe. So he suddenly had this big picture of the world. And here I live European people, and I have a pretty exotic story. So, we fell in love, and he converted, and he did that because of my family. Like, he just got that there was this huge hole in my family, and he was really happy to do that. He wasn't particularly religious, but he treated my parents really well. Now, they were wildly opposed to us getting married, as many of you can imagine those. But what was wonderful is they lived long enough to really love him and see the quality that he had. And after my mother had a stroke, he carried her up the stairs of our house. You know, it was just really a very loving thing, and he treated them very. So my husband, we wanted to travel. So after the time we met, we started saving money to go to Europe. And he'd go to Hungary. And like, it never even crossed my mind, really? Go to Hungary? Why would I do that? My mother was still healthy then, and I wanted my mother to come along because I said, I don't speak Hungarian, I won't know anybody. And she said, I can't go, I feel like I went there. But her friend Margot, who you saw the pictures of earlier on, was still in the same town. So she wrote to Margot, and I think they had kept in touch. You know, my daughter and her husband are going to come. So, so we went to Cabo. So this is 1979. What's interesting, I didn't know the old train station, but in the background, they were just building a new train station, so that old one's not there anymore. So we get off the train. I took a little bit of Hungarian that one semester course, just to learn enough to ask where the bathroom is, things like that. And I get off the train, and the best Hungarian that I could muster, I asked, is there a taxi here? And the person like laughed at me. They really laughed and said, no, no. And Rosenfeld's on the other side were my mother's boyfriend's family. So, you know, just like I recognize the names, and I know some of those people are. So in 1979, here's the house. So if you remember, the house was white before in the first picture, so now the house is brown. I went and knocked on the door, took us to the house and showed me which house it was, because we didn't have a house number. They didn't even have house numbers when my mother lived there. So the person was really unfriendly and kind of, you know, standoffish. Margot didn't say anything to me. Thought was, now I know they thought we were coming to claim the house because people feared that Jews were going to come back and reclaim it. And actually people didn't. They wanted to get the heck out of there. But I just wanted to see it. So, you know, we did get to see it. We got to take a few pictures. Now I realize Margot didn't introduce me to anybody. There had to have been other people in that town who knew my parents, who might have told me stories, you know, might have had pictures. No one. We stayed with them at their house for 2 days. They took us to other schools, showed us, you know, did the swimming pool where they went swimming, even took us to an amusement park that my mother had gone to. But ultimately, they didn't introduce us to a soul. So that was kind of interesting. So this is what it's a very rural area. It was in 79. It is, and that's back of my mother's house. So you can see grapevines. My mother, that's what they made wine, and I told you wine and schnapps and whiskeys. That's the town hall in the town, and that's the Hungarian Reformed Church. So time goes by, and my husband says, he's back. And we've never seen your father's hometown. We should go. And you know, for me, it's always like, oh, you know, really? You know, I'm so glad it's one of his great qualities that, you know, he can sort of go past that, my reluctance, and say, this is a good thing to do, you should do this. So we hadn't even planned to go to Cabo. We were just going to go to the Ukraine and go to my father's hometown. My brother, in the meanwhile, had looked online and found my father's parents in the cemetery records. So that was kind of exciting, and, you know, we were sort of planning this whole thing. And I didn't even want to stop, and thought like, okay, let's just, well, the train goes through there on the way anyway from Budapest to the Ukraine. Let's just get off the train for a couple hours and get back on. And then Steve said, well, why don't we just spend one night? So I went on booking.com and booked a place. And it was called Tulipan, which is tulip. And I wrote to the person who was the booking.com of the place and said, can you meet us at the train station? And I didn't actually ever hear back from him, so I just, you know, we just went. So this is Balázs, and when we got off the train, he laughed like, uproariously and said, I was sure you were not going to show up. Why would anybody from America want to come to Cabo? And he just laughed and laughed. He was very jolly, and he spoke great English because he had studied in London for a couple of years. So he was really fun. Sorry, I'm just looking at my time because I'm talking a lot. So he took us back to the place. It turns out it had 3 or 4 rooms in it. It was a house that had been subdivided. And a picture of Margot. Do you know this woman? No. Do you know this house? I showed a picture of my parents' house. No, I don't know that house. Left us there, and we decided to go for a walk. Asked, do you know this woman? And he was very like, no. And then I was a little bit persistent, so he went in the house and her, who was about 40, 50, and she came out. She wasn't friendly either. And I just said, like, you know, just trying to find my mother's house, and my father doesn't know anything. So I got really discouraged, and I think I got a little tearful. And I kind of said, like, Mom, you have to help me. I'm lost. And, you know, I was really feeling bad, like, I can't find you. So we stopped at a little store that was, so this was walking around. These were just pictures we took walking around trying, does that look familiar? Like, I don't know, maybe that looks sort of familiar. It really wasn't. More chickens and doves. So the word on this store is gyümölcs, which is fruit, right? Gyümölcs, for anybody who knows Hungarian. So I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, so I wanted to go get some fruits and vegetables. So we go to, and we're standing right in front of the door, but we also were trying to decide whether we wanted to carry groceries to the cemetery, because the cemetery was a little bit far. So this woman comes out with a bicycle, and she says in English, "Can I help you?" So this is right after I had my little breakdown. And I was just surprised for anybody to speak English. It's not a big English-speaking town. And I said, we're trying to find my mother's house. And she later, she doesn't usually talk to strangers. She certainly doesn't talk to people in English typically. And she thought we needed help shopping. She thought like we needed help buying something. So I said, I'm trying to find my mother's house. And she said, my father knows every house in this town, and he'll help you. So she walked us bike to her house, to her parents' house. And so this is her mother and her aunt. And they were working on their theology. Just happened to be when we walked in. And then they're not related, it would be a lot more dramatic, but their names were Marika, which were the names of my mother's brother's 2 girls. I said he married and had 2 daughters, the same names. So, you know, it's just like, oh wow, it's another sign. And Marianne brought out the food. Anybody who knows Hungarian people, you come in their house, they lay out the food. And, you know, they had no idea who we were. English, only Judith spoke English, so she translated for us. So we waited for the dad to come home. This is the dad, Dula. He was showing Olympics. He represented Hungary in the Olympics in track and field things. So he was showing us. He also he runs a musical theater in Kaba. And they do seduction every year. They were doing Mamma Mia that year. So, you know, like just all kinds of fun. So show him the picture of the house, at it, and he says to his daughter, "Az Balázs haza." So Balázs, the guy who picked us up from the train station, lives in my mother's house. Right? Unbelievable? Unbelievable. So I almost fell off my chair. Balázs is Judith's cousin. So she comes and tells them, hey, those people staying at your place, we were staying at another property he owns. He owns more than one property. That's her mother's house. And I showed her Margot's picture. She said, Benedict Margot. Turned out that the aunt is a school. She's a principal of a preschool. And the preschool was right near where Margot lived. She had been a widow at that point. And the school children, these streets. So she knew Margot. Unfortunately, Margot had passed away, her husband had passed away, and the son was vacationing because she tried to call him up. He was vacationing, he wasn't at home. But meanwhile, so we've made this giant connection. Then it turns out that Judith works in the city hall, and she said, can you come back? Because we were supposed to leave for the Ukraine the next morning. And she said, can you come back? Because I'll look and see if I know about your parents. So we decided to cut a day off our trip to the Ukraine and come back. And she said we could stay in Balázs's house. We would be able to stay in my mother's house, which, you know, I can't tell you, just it was very emotional. It was really amazing. So this is Munkacs, where my father was from, and it's famous fortress. And this is the Jewish cemetery in Munkacs. It's enormous. Had 30,000 Jews. about 50% of the population of Munkac was Jewish. And it was a big cultural center, had lots of Jewish schools, you know. I thought it was a little town. The way my dad talked about it, I assumed it was some little town, like my mother's little town. I never knew that it was this giant place. But we were there with nobody. We didn't speak Ukrainian or Czech. I got by a little bit on my little bit of Hungarian. And we walked in this cemetery. It's normally locked. So we had all these like pieces of luck that the gate was open. So we just went in. We assumed it was open. We later found out it's always locked and you have to let you in. But yet the door was open when we went there. The gate was open. So I was really desperately trying to find a stone that sits on it. What I found out was you can see all these stones that look very regular and very symmetrical. It was because in '60, the Russians bulldozed the cemetery. And evidently someone found out about it, and before it was completely bulldozed, stopped it, and they moved the stones and the remains, I assume, to another, like further out of town, next to a Christian cemetery. And they put up these memorial stones. And all these broken pieces are kind of arranged a memorial. So, so I didn't find a stone for my parents. But look at the size of this place. It is absolutely incredibly big. So then another piece of luck, we walked in, it was another heat wave. It was in the 90s, and we didn't even have water, would know how far we were going to be going, so we went into a bar and bought bottles of water and walked to this. My husband has a great sense, reads maps really well. So we find a cemetery, but all we can find is the Christian part of the cemetery. So I was not going to give up at that. I walk around and I see someone who looks like a cemetery keeper, and I drew a picture of a Jewish star and held it up, and I said Hungarian, and he walked us all the way to the Jewish cemetery. And it was a walk. He just dropped what he was doing and walked us to the Jews behind a big gate. And this guy, Yoshka, is the keeper of the Jewish cemetery, and he said he has been since World War II. I think he's in his 80s, and he and his wife are the keepers of this cemetery. He spoke a little Hungarian. I had a Hungarian dictionary with me. But while we walked, the other man said in Hungarian, one God. And he was, you know, he was just trying to be nice to me. It was really nice, like the fact that he walked to me, but that was, he could say something I could understand, and that was really special. So this is the better stones. He found the records of my dad's no stones, so I think they were bulldozed and I think they were lost. But he was wonderful, and his wife, who they didn't really, we had very language, thought they didn't understand that we'd already been to the cemetery, because in her mind it's always locked, so how could we have been to the cemetery? So she walks us to the cemetery in the 90-degree heat, and we went through it all again. And so I found this stone, which for any of you who can see any of the Hebrew, looks like Robinson in Hebrew letters. So it could be, and Robinson rabbi, so that's why his name was Robinson there. I don't know, and I don't even know that for sure, so we did a run and brought it home and took pictures, just in case. So we went back to Kaba. Judith and her mother had made us in 3 days. You know, it's like the miracle of Hanukkah. It was a hardbound book, and she put everything that I might be interested in this book in the intervening days. And it was beautiful. It was beautifully done. And she found my mother's birth certificate. So this was my mother's birth. And what's so wonderful about it is Haj Shimone would be like Mrs. Simon Haas. So it was my grandmother. And you know, just to see, like, you have to get, I had nothing of any of my grandparents, like, to see her name on this certificate was so emotional. And then I found out other things, a few other things. Oh, so the other, this woman here, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So I found out a little more about it. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So I found out a little more about it. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith took me to see her. So it turns out that this woman, Irenka, the woman in the front, Judith to was my mother's brother's baker's assistant. She was a teenager and kind of a helper because he came back from the camps evidently a few months before my mother did. This stuff, she told me all of these stories. And she said that he came back first, and because the bakery equipment was still there but bake, my uncle had nothing, but he knew how to bake. So they kind of formed an alliance, and they started up the bake. And she was his housekeeper, his baker's assistant. And then my mother came back 2 months later. And evidently, I totally believe this, my mother was not happy that she was helping her brother in the business, and kind of, it sounded like gave her the, you know, we don't need you, get out of here. And, but she was really nice. So all of her, she has 9 siblings, they're all still alive, the 90s and early hundreds. And so she obviously, this was, you have to understand, this was her best room, it's a cottage. And so she sort of put on the dog for us. She brought out fruit, and you know, it was just really lovely and hospitable. And you can ask me anything. Ask me anything. So what I had always wanted to ask somebody was, what were you thinking when these people were marched out of town? What were you thinking? Didn't you do anything? So I asked her that. And she said, we were scared. She said, and I'm sure the Nazis circulated the stories because it would work really well for them, that anybody who tried to help the Jews would be immediately shot. We were scared. So I told you I have 3 daughters, birth to, and we have a 4th daughter now. And I thought about, how would I be if I thought somebody might shoot? Would I be brave enough to say, no, I'm, standing up for these people? And these are the kind of things that children have survived themselves with. If you read any of the literature, would I have been brave? Would I have survived? Could I have faced starvation? My bread to my child, because my mother talked about her sister would give all of her bread to her daughter and wouldn't eat. And there I was in this situation with this woman, and I couldn't honestly say, I wish I could say, you know what, no matter what, some peace in my heart that I don't know what I would have done. Do I wish people had done things differently? Of course. But I just don't know. I don't know children, my children's lives at risk. I just don't know. So, I don't know. It was like for me, it was a transformative experience. Because I felt like, there's a lot of arguments about forgiveness, so I'm not even good. Understanding that I just got that I don't know, and I don't know what was going through people's minds, and different. But this woman sat there and let me ask her anything, and she didn't have to do that. And what I'm guessing is that when we were there in 1979, nobody wanted to talk to us. And she was willing to talk to us, and she told me stories about my mother that I had never heard. She gave me information that filled some holes in her story. The other really fascinating thing she said was, one day, all the Jews in town disappeared after the war. So a bunch of people had come back, family members. She said one night, all the Jews disappeared. And the thing happened is, there were after pogroms, after the war. My guess is someone heard a rumor that people killed the Jews in Kuba, and they all went to Budapest. That's what I think happened, because that's where my mother ended up. It was in Budapest with my dad. But for all the Jews in town to disappear overnight, like that's not something that just happened spontaneously. Something happened, and somebody made a plan, and that happened. So that's what I found out from Marenka, and that's my mother's house now, where Balish lives. And that's the backyard now. Remember, it used to have grapevines in it. Now it's a loft. That's gone. But the fruit trees are still there. So I kind of just wanted to go soak up the juju of the fruit. They talked about it so much, how they would climb the trees and eat fruit all summer. And it was just one of the happy memories that she shared. So I just wanted to go hang out under the fruit tree. And then that's the townhouse and Judith taking us around. So after we came back to Pittsburgh, Judith sent us this picture, and that as an act of something, not contrition exactly, but just acknowledgement. She and her sister painted all of the names they had kind of worn away, and that was not an easy job. There's a lot of names. And when I got another email from her, she said people gave her a lot of grief about it. A lot of people said, "Why are you doing that? You know, why is that your business?" What, you know, shows that, you know, not everybody is in a positive frame of mind. But to me, that was such a beautiful act. It was just a wonderful thing. So that's actually, excuse me, my time. And does anybody have any questions or anything? Yes.
Did they have the
Numbers. Actually, they did not. My mother was transferred from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, and she didn't get. It's another thing that makes me wonder, because often they did not tattoo women who were being used as sex slaves because they didn't want them damaged. You know, again, I don't know, but I know she did not have numbers, even though she was in from 44 till 45 till the liberation. Sorry?
I said that 44, 45 was the end. They didn't check the numbers anymore.
Ah, okay. So what he said was that they weren't checking numbers anymore towards the end. Thank you. So I didn't know that. Yes.
How far was the city from Budapest?
Kuba was about, I want to say 2 hours from Budapest. It was closer to the Ukraine than to Budapest. So you would go straight due east. You go due east from Budapest, maybe an hour and a half before you hit the Ukraine border. Yes?
You said that your father hid things in the backyard?
Oh, that was my mother. So that was another great story that Irenka told. She said that one of the people in town wanted to help the Jews and took a cartload of stuff to bury it out of town. That people didn't get it, and that he was shot by the Germans on his way back into town. So nobody knew where he buried the stuff. And she was saying there's been rumors of Jewish treasure, you know, that, you know, they know there's Jewish treasure somewhere, but, you know, that was what she said. I just want to say a word about my daughters. One of my daughters is the whatever feelings of relief that I had from talking to Irenka. She's not sure that she thinks I might be going too far in the forgiveness direction, and so she's still mulling it over, but I believe that she's going to come up with a special, and so if she does, I'll make sure that it finds its way here to the Holocaust Center, because she's a really good cartoon artist, and I think it'd be really neat, so I'm hoping she does that. I think I'm just going to say one word about epigenetics. I did a talk here about epigenetics ago. So there's a lot of cellular evidence that children of survivors and even grandchildren of survivors have alterations in their DNA that are very specific and very similar. So this field of study is fairly new because recently have had the technology to break DNA down so microscopically. But in specific, one of the things they found is that the way that people who are thusly affected metabolize cortisol, which is the stress hormone, is altered. And children of survivors do have higher incidence of anxiety, depression, PTSD. And so it may be that there are things that they're going to discover, and they're using that research now to study other groups that have been historically, you know, traumatized. And as I've read suggests that because so many Jews in the US and in Israel have gone into fields like psychology and genetics, and there was this whole population of people who all experienced similar things all at the same time. It was a treasure trove of the ability to study a population. And not that that's a good thing that there are genetic alterations, but that it might be a contribution to other people's, and to even studying, like how does that happen, and how do you treat it, and are there things you can do for people? So that's something very interesting on the horizon about kids of Holocaust survivors. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I have only recently started speaking, and you can probably tell. And it's how I honor my parents. So really thank you for showing up on a really beautiful evening. I appreciate it very much. This movie's really fun. If you, fun is probably a strong word, but it's an animation. But we'll say that for another time. You can Google it. It's a really, really good animation. I'm just concerned about time, but it's just well worth watching. I feel like this person captured the essence of being a child in Holocaust survivors. I don't know how the building is. If there are people who want to stay and watch. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Dan. Okay. So it's a 15-minute animation called I Was a Child of Holocaust Survivors. It's really good. But I also understand that we're up. So I would say if there are people who want to see it, I'll wait like 5 minutes and let people leave who need to leave or would like to leave. But if you want to stay, I'm willing to say it's just well worth watching. I've seen it 3 times and it stuns me every time. And because it's an animation, it's not disturbing. It's just very impactful.
Thank you, and you honor your parents and you honor all of us by sharing this story. Thank you so much. So, are people interested?